The Mar-a-Lago raid. The IRS gets tens of thousands of new agents, and has Dark Brandon revived his presidency? We'll discuss all this and more on this edition of The Editors. I'm Rich Lowry. I'm joined as always by the Right Honorable Charles C.W. Cook, Alexandra DeSanctis, and the notorious MBD, Michael Brendan Doherty. You are, of course, listening to a National Review podcast. Our sponsors this episode are the new Brad Thor thriller, Rising Tiger, and the Acton Unwind podcast. More about all of them in due course. If for some of you are not already following us on a streaming service, you can find us everywhere from Spotify to iTunes. And if you like what you hear here, please consider giving us a glowing 5-star review on iTunes. If you don't like what you hear here, please forget I said anything. So MBD, we're recording at our accustomed time, late Tuesday morning. Big doings down in Florida. Yesterday, there was an FBI raid search pretty much all day. They started at 10 in the morning. We learned about this when Trump put out a statement, of course, blasting what was going on. And there was a fairly thermonuclear reaction on the right. We were discussing right before we started recording, former Governor Mike Huckabee was on Fox saying that this should lead Republicans to nominating Donald Trump by acclamation, and just everyone putting their shoulder to the wheel and electing him and saving the country. What do you make of
it? Well, listen, I come at this with two biases. One, which is Donald Trump is perfectly capable of doing something worth investigating. And two, that the FBI is a disgrace, a clown show, a blot on our nation's history, and J. Edgar Hoover should be named among America's greatest villains, not among the big buildings in Washington, D.C. So, I have a little bit of a Iran-Iraq war attitude of why can't they both lose, but this is good for Trump because it doesn't look like there's, at least on first blush, it doesn't look like there is, this is like a nailed down surprise DOJ investigation of a new matter. It looks like this is about the handling of classified documents. And usually this doesn't result in giant splashy raids by the FBI. The reaction you're seeing is the product of the right's fundamental and growing distrust of institutions like the FBI. And you're seeing a renewal of their personal bond with Trump. And this is the most dangerous part of populism. This is the part I really don't like, right? Like, the part I like about populism is it's a warning sign to elites that there's some kind of misalignment between the governing class and the governed that needs to be repaired. The really dangerous spot is when you're seeing a ton of tweets basically saying, like, they could do this to you. Well, they're probably not going to raid my house. They're raiding a powerful person's house. But that kind of personal identification with Trump, like, he is suffering for me. If he is willing to put up with this, like, I have to be willing to sacrifice for him, at least willing to vote for him. And it just blows things out of the water. Like, last time I was on the show, we were talking about Ron DeSantis, and I think was definitely on the path to being very competitive with Trump, and we're talking about him suspending a county prosecutor, and that was a big deal, and that shows a certain instinct and approach to governing that it speaks well for him. But in terms of just sheer drama and attention getting and the investment of the heart, I mean, there's just no beating Trump, right? Like, it's just, he is where the action is, and now he is the center of politics again. And you can tell there's a thrill. The thing that makes it such a dynamic situation is it's a thrill for everyone, right? The left loves this. And, Saul Alinsky said, a good tactic is a tactic your people enjoy, and they are enjoying this. I think the media loves it because Trump is good for media ratings and clicks and analysis in a way that Biden and DeSantis and Mitch McConnell aren't. So you feel the feeding frenzy again. It felt like we're being transported.
2017 again.
Yeah.
So, Zan, on the merits of this, where I am, and there's more to know, obviously, is that this must have been technically, legally justified, right? I mean, you need all sorts of sign off, including from a judge, although you have to put a caveat around that, given what we learned about the FBI's conduct of the Russia investigation and the Carter Page FISA warrant. I was inclined to believe early on in the Carter Page controversy, well, that they wouldn't lie, would they? That, it wasn't, a judge wouldn't sign off on a meritless surveillance request when all that turned out to be true. But there must be, in my mind, some legal justification here. But what you would want to do is find the most minimal, least invasive way, if this is really about classified documents, which all the reporting suggests, to resolve this dispute. You wouldn't want to blow it up. And I think part of what might be going on here is that the Justice Department, because they're under so much pressure from the left and from the media, actually wants to blow it up. They like the visuals here that are so inflammatory and constitute an act of political arson, because it shows how serious they're taking this matter, and they're sticking it to Trump. And as MBD says in the Alinsky reference, their side loves it. And Andy McCarthy is up with a column this morning on the website, arguing that this raid was pretextual, that they really are searching after the bigger case against Trump, a January 6th related case, but they don't have that nailed down. They do know that he has classified documents that he shouldn't, or have strong suspicion that he does. So they're using this to go undertake a search that they're hoping turns up evidence that would help them in a January 6th case, because there's no way they're actually going to indict him over classified documents.
Yeah, I think there's certainly something to what Andy argues. For me, I think I would want to start by finding out what the search warrant actually says, what the reason was. I think we'll be able to tell pretty quickly whether it's a pretense or a pretext based on what they claimed they're going to find. I think we'll probably see a lot of people on the right, if they didn't actually end up finding anything that was worth searching for. I think people on the right will point to that and say, well, they didn't find anything. Now, that's not really, it doesn't discredit the idea that they shouldn't be looking, or doesn't prove that they shouldn't have been there looking, right? They might have had a good reason to go in and look, but we just don't know. And I think Andy's right. Whether it's about January 6th or not, I don't know. But I do think that they are trying to build some bigger case, not just he took classified documents. And to your first point, really, I think this is the kind of thing that's just going to serve to further divide right and left on Trump and the end of the Trump presidency. And what we're seeing is a response from a Justice Department and FBI that has been under fire from Democrats now basically for 2 years over why they haven't gotten Trump yet, why they're not trying harder, why they're not, the assumption being, of course, there's some way to get him, whatever get him means, and you just aren't trying. If you haven't done it yet, it's because you're not working hard enough or you don't want to. Why are you letting him get away with things? Things being unclear. And I think that they want to just go after him in some sense, whatever they can do to look like they're going after him, to get credit with their own side, to keep Trump in the news. That's obviously advantageous to them. Trump is the biggest threat, I think, to the Republican Party right now. And this proves it. Republicans are rallying around him. They're back to, supporting Trump, at least because this was unfair to him, or people are saying that it was. So it's going to just further divide people over Trump, which in the end, I think is mostly good for Democrats.
So, Charlie, what would you make of the left's pushback against what I was just saying a moment ago, that prudentially you wouldn't want to pursue such a warrant, even if you could get a judge to sign off on it, because it has, so consequential, including politically. And their rejoinder would be, well, look, no one's above the law. Donald Trump is not above the law if he has classified documents and he's in possession of them in violation of the law. Yeah, you go raid the guy. Just the way you'd raid MBD if you had him.
Well, would you raid MBD? We have been through a classified documents saga involving a presidential candidate in recent years, that being Hillary Clinton. And she wasn't raided. And for that matter, she wasn't prosecuted. And one of the reasons that she wasn't prosecuted was that the Justice Department said, we don't tend to prosecute these crimes.
Mm-hmm.
We don't, in other words, go after MBD. I think that it is important here to define our terms. The rejoinder that you just shared, Rich, is a 30,000 feet assertion. That being that nobody is above the law, including former presidents. And I agree with that. I do not think that per se it is indicative of a banana republic for the federal government or a state government, if appropriate, to investigate or even prosecute a former president or a presidential candidate. If it were, then our presidential candidates and presidents would indeed be above the law. But that is not what we're talking about here. We know that the FBI and the Department of Justice investigates presidents and presidential candidates because it's doing it to Donald Trump and it did it to Hillary Clinton. The question is, was this raid appropriate? Was it justified? Was it proportionate? And I have a number of questions about that cannot be answered simply by saying that Trump isn't above the law. I was racking my brain this morning trying to imagine a circumstance in which this raid was necessary. And unless Donald Trump has done something heinous, and we're all about to discover that what we have known hitherto is chronically incomplete.
Yeah,
I can't see.
Like he has names of classified agents that are taped on the wall for anyone to see, or they sharing with foreign power.
Right.
Something beyond the careless handling of classified documents and what was surely a chaotic exit from the White House.
Yeah, and unless it is something like that, I can't see that this was appropriate. Now, that is not the same thing as saying there is no case against Donald Trump. There might be. Of course, if there is a case against Donald Trump, it's going to have to be compared pretty closely with the one against Hillary Clinton, given that Hillary Clinton was not prosecuted. But we're talking here about the raid. And I noted on the corner this morning that the reaction, the line, the argument around which many in the press seem to have swiftly coalesced is that the fact that this raid was a norm-breaking event, the fact that this raid, as George Conway put it, crossed the Rubicon, suggests that there must be something substantial to justify it.
Right.
George Conway said, and I'll quote, "They've crossed the Rubicon here. Not even Richard Nixon's house in San Clemente was searched by the FBI, as far as I know. You have to conclude there's something behind the curtain that would surprise us." David Axelrod last night on Twitter said one thing is very clear. Garland, that being Merrick Garland, would not have authorized this raid, and no federal judge would have signed off on it if there weren't significant evidence to warrant it. Now, maybe that's true. Yeah, and if that is true, then that's fine.
Yeah, but it's like saying, because this is so norm-breaking, it must be right.
Right. Well, it's an illiberal presumption, but it is, of course, axiomatically correct. But I would like to know, and no one has shared this, not George Conway, not David Axelrod, not the panels I've been watching on cable news in which this has been the conventional wisdom. I would like to know in detail what those people think should happen if, in fact, there is nothing behind the curtain to surprise us, or there weren't significant evidence to warrant it. Because it seems to me that if that is the case, then this is extremely serious. This isn't the sort of thing where you say, oh, well, I guess. I mean, George Conway used the phrase cross the Rubicon. You don't cross the Rubicon and then say, oops. You have to be pretty sure before you cross the Rubicon. So I think we ought to define our terms here. If this raid was justified, then it is a good example of how nobody in the United States is above the law. But what is it if it wasn't justified? Who should resign? What does it tell us about the FBI? What does it tell us about President Biden, who is in charge of the Department of Justice? There's none of this fourth branch nonsense that progressives always imply. It's independent. It's not independent. It sits within the executive branch. Now, there was actually a useful quote in Politico this morning. This lawyer said, if they raided that's Trump's home, justifying classified documents he took from the White House, he will be re-elected president in 2024. Hands down, it will prove to be the greatest law enforcement mistake in history. That is a really useful statement because it lays out the parameters here. It says if the FBI was just looking for classified documents he took from the White House, that's not good enough. It says that if that is the case, it will prove to be a mistake and the consequences will be deleterious. I would like ahead of time to know from the media and legal establishment what they think should happen if this turns out to be beyond the pale. Because it's not going to be good enough here just to walk away. Yes, there are an awful lot of people in the Republican Party who will defend Trump whatever he does. Yes, sometimes skepticism toward our authorities goes a little bit far and ranges into conspiracy. But if the authorities have stepped out of line here to the degree that it looks as if they may have, there have to be profound consequences for that. Because again, we're not talking here in the abstract about whether or not Trump is above the law. He's not. We're talking about whether this raid was justified. Now, why do we raid people? We don't raid them as a matter of course, especially in these circumstances when it's so politically fraught. We raid them when it is urgent, when the evidence pertains to something that is about to happen, when one can't wait any longer, when there's a possibility that the target is going to destroy or use the evidence in a way that will be irreversible. We raid them when there's no other way to get hold of information that they have in their possession, that there's no means by which to do it that does not involve a surprise visit. And we raid them when anyone else in their situation would be raided. If those criteria aren't met, I think that there is a big problem here, and it should yield I use the hated phrase, national conversation about the role and habits of the FBI and the Department of Justice and the nature of political retaliation.
Yeah. Now, of course, that will never happen. If it's unjustified, the experience of the Russia hoax and the Carter Page FISA warrant is that the people who defended it or are very enthusiastic about it will just shut up about it and move on, or find some way to try to justify the unjustifiable, which they're still doing, a lot of them with the Russia investigation. So MBD, let's assume for the sake of argument that Andy is right, and what the Justice Department is really after here is some sort of January 6th related indictment. Is there anything, what's your take on that at the moment? Do you think there is any case to be made against Trump? Should he be indicted? Is that a reasonable consideration? And if the answer is no, is there any evidence that possibly could emerge that would change your view?
Well, everyone's going to have to make sure that their opinions on this match their opinions on whether Donald Trump asking President Zelensky for any information on Hunter Biden was a political crime. Because just fishing around for using one investigation over a nothing burger matter as pretext for another one that's more explosive, that's an abuse, right? I mean, so I don't think there's a case, and it will radicalize me if the result of this is like Liz Cheney gets to read Tucker Carlson's texts to the president over the last couple of years.
We thought we thought you were already radicalized, MBD.
Well,
we haven't seen nothing yet.
No, what I mean is, I will feel the kind of Trump revenge instinct if that's what ends up happening here. Right now, I mean that the FBI needs to go is, I've agreed with Charlie on that for a long time. I mean, it's just constant abuse from this organization and constant mishandling of politics. I mean, I would have thought Democrats learned this with Comey and Hillary Clinton, right? I mean, people don't remember, but before Comey resigned and became an anti-Trump resistance hero, he was the villain for Democrats because he reopened the investigation into Hillary Clinton in the last week of the campaign, and kind of gave her tongue lashing. And, they think that through the election, it's like a great chance for people to finally learn the lesson, which we should have learned in the 70s when it came out about how the Johnson administration was using the FBI to spy on the Goldwater campaign. We should have learned the lesson then that this outfit should not be involved in high-level politics at all.
So would you eliminate the FBI?
Tomorrow, of course. Zero the budget. Create a totally different agency if you're going to have these stupid statutes on the book. But like from top to bottom, it would just be,
there'd be a new agency, or its functions would be absorbed into other,
possibly other agencies,
other law enforcement agencies.
Possibly other agencies, but I think Charlie was the one. It is a disgrace that we have an institution built upon the name of J. Edgar Hoover.
Yeah, that's crazy. So, Zan, we've heard a lot of this kind of sentiment the last 12 hours. Talk about, sorry, we can't fight this legally, politically. We've got to take it to the streets. We're a step closer to civil war or the end of the republic. What do you make of that sort of rhetoric?
I think that's a really dangerous way of looking at this. Obviously, I agree that if it turns out they didn't have a real justification for being there and it was a pretext just for, drumming up news attention about Trump, or as Andy argues about January 6th, I think that's a serious problem. And it will certainly radicalize a lot of people who, if they haven't already been, or will intensify the anger of a lot of people who are already rightly angry about the kind of manipulation of these departments for political ends, or agencies, I should say, for political ends. But I don't think that it should be used as a justification for violence. Obviously, I think it should be a justification for voting for people who know that it's wrong. And that's, in this case, I think Republicans, regardless of what you think of Trump.
So, Charlie, I texted you this last night, the tweet from Ron DeSantis that I don't have it right in front of me, but referred to the regime. This is another sign of the regime will just do anything to defend its power and prerogatives. And it ended with the statement, banana republic. We're living in a banana republic. And that notably picks up some rhetoric. We've heard kind of from Claremont Institute types who really believe the legitimacy of the entire American system is in doubt. So how do you think about basically the same question I asked Dan? How do you think about that rhetoric? Is it justified? Is it too extreme, et cetera?
I think we will find out. I think we will see what happens in this case. It matters a great deal what's in that warrant and what consequences there are if there's nothing of note. I think if this was a fishing expedition, as Andy McCarthy has suggested, or if this was tied only to presidential records, then we will need to see some resignations. I think Merrick Garland would have to go.
So, Charlie, just put a pin on that. So if it's just a records matter, you think that would constitute an abuse and would make it not justified, even if it's just black and white violation of the law, but it's just over records?
I think that the political consequences of raiding the home of a former president are such that to, in George Conway's words, cross the Rubicon over that matter would be at best incompetence and at worst a malicious overreach. And it would so turn half the country against the Department of Justice that the man leading the Department of Justice and the FBI for that matter would have to resign, yes. As I say, I don't think for a moment that presidents are above the law, but I am not aware of many Americans being raided over an issue such as that one. I think it's worth saying again that the vast majority of the people who have commented on this, most of whom do not like Trump, as I don't, have conceded the first position, which is this is an extraordinary development in American life. As such, if it turns out that it was unjustified, there have to be real consequences. And if there aren't, I don't think we live in a banana republic, but I think we live in a country that has institutions that have gone rogue and that need to be substantially reformed, or preferably, in the case of the FBI, abolished.
So MBD asks a question to you. Rate your current level of trust for federal law enforcement and the Department of Justice. 10. These people are non-political professionals that can be trusted implicitly. 0, you believe there's no abuse that they're not capable of.
It's about 2. I mean, I guess a 0 would be when they take Melania to a black site or something. But yeah, it's like a 2. I mean, it's just once you dug in on the Russia stuff, it was like suddenly the agents are having affairs with each other. They're basically texting, Orange Man bad to each other. Like they couldn't even keep it professional, right? Like you're human. You're going to have political feelings and ambitions, but you've got to know what your role is, what your institution ought to be, given its function in our system. And the FBI just doesn't know what it's, and can't keep its agents continent enough about it. So I expect all the usual blather, right? All the the tearful, tweets about the Liberty Bell or whatever from FBI figures to try to shine up their fundamental patriotism, and how dare you question them. It's a joke.
You're reminding me of that period where, remember when James Comey was just posting these weird random photos of himself on Twitter, like standing in the middle of a road in Iowa or something?
It was just, I mean, come on. Yes, like that's what I expect. I expect these people to expose themselves for the ridiculousness that they are. This is Trump's superpower. And it's terrifying, right? Like he offends people. He deserves some of the books being thrown at him. But then the people throwing them turn out to be like brain dead or total freaks that you wouldn't trust as dog catcher. So yeah, I'm not feeling great about the Republic or the federal law enforcement at the moment.
All right, Sam, we have a 2 on the board.
I'd say I'm at a 4. I mean, I definitely am coming from the same place, but I'm maybe a little bit more naive or more optimistic that it's not totally corrupt through and through. I think people who make the decisions are willing to do pretty much anything if it serves their political ends. But I kind of think there's probably something worth preserving in there if you could clear out the rot.
So, Charlie, I'm guessing you're going to be somewhere in the range between 0 and 2.
Yeah, I think that this country has a great deal of tools for renewal and strong institutions. And as I say, I'm going to wait and see what we learn and then what happens as a result of what we learn. So I find it hard to put a number on it.
No number for Charlie. I guess I go a 4, a judicious 4 with Zan. I don't trust them on any politically sensitive question related to Trump. Otherwise, I think they're, doing good work, cracking down on drug gangs or whatever.
Are they?
Probably. I assume maybe we'll have to delve into that one deeper, but I assume they are. But the stuff that has been on our radar screen and subject to so much debate in the last several years is just really.
And you're not winning me over there because I'm against them cracking down on drug gangs.
Exactly.
And I think the drug dealers have carte blanche. So.
All right. So with that, let's pause and hear from our first sponsor this episode. From number 1, New York Times bestselling author Brad Thor comes a riveting new thriller, Rising Tiger. When the Chinese military launches a barbaric attack on India, America's top spy is drawn into the fray. But in the fight for democracy, who's the predator and who's the prey? Best Thriller Books raves that, quote, thriller fans of all stripes will devour this book. Read or listen to Rising Tiger today, available now in hardcover, ebook, and as an audiobook, read by Armin Schultz. Again, it's Rising Tiger, the new thriller by Brad Thor. Please check it out. So, Charlie, somewhat relatedly, we've had a debate last couple of days over the Schumer Manchin deal, which has a massive plus up for IRS enforcement. So massive, the IRS literally, it doesn't know. I think you had a former commissioner saying, I have no idea how the IRS is going to even absorb all these agents. One estimate is that it would be 80,000 more FBI agents. I think that's maybe bigger. Dan Crenshaw was tweeting bigger than all Border Patrol or something like that. It's hard to get your head around the number. And there's been this debate. You wrote a post about it where people say, well, look, what do you, if you're abiding by the law and filing your taxes the way you should, and your hands are clean, what do you have to worry about if there are a few more IRS agents doing some more audits?
That is a totalitarian question. And one doesn't have to oppose the prospect of IRS auditing completely in order to think so. There's 2 problems with that. First off, that is a grotesque way of seeing government, especially the federal government, in any context. That's the equivalent of saying, if you're not carrying a gun illegally, why'd you care about stop and frisk? Well, we don't evaluate questions of privacy and power in that way in the United States. We don't or shouldn't presume that somebody who is in favor of the 4th Amendment must be hiding illegal substances in his house. We don't assume that somebody who favors the 5th Amendment's right against self-incrimination is a criminal. The idea that the only reason that one might oppose hiring 80,000 more IRS agents and increasing the number of audits is because one's cheating on one's taxes has no place in a free country. There are reasons to worry about IRS audits that transcend criminal behavior. The IRS can turn your life upside down. Even if at the end of the process, you get a letter saying everything is in order, it is scary to be contacted by the IRS and asked for all sorts of private information. Anyone who has been audited will talk to you about this. They will tell you about the stress this engenders. They will tell you about the cost that this engenders. So let's not pretend that the critics of this are tax cheats. They're not, and they're no more so than anyone else who opposes government overreach or who favors classically liberal provisions within the law. But there's also a difference with the IRS, and that is that audits are not triggered by probable cause. My local police department would not say we're going to randomly pick 19 people in my town and see if they've committed a murder. They would have a much more robust process for selecting those people they intended to investigate. But that's not the case with the IRS. The IRS does not have a probable cause standard. The IRS has an algorithm, a rudimentary algorithm, an algorithm that looks for behavior that is outside of the norm, which does not mean criminal behavior, which does not mean probably illegal behavior, which does not mean cheating. It means anything that sits outside of average distributions. The purpose of hiring these agents, in part, is to increase the number of audits that the IRS can do. And that means flagging more people whose returns, for whatever reason, maybe they gave more than they usually do to charity this year. Maybe they made a loss this year. Maybe they have a home office that has new furniture in it. It means flagging new people and investigating them, if not at random, pretty much close to it, and then proceeding on a presumption of guilt. I think that Americans are absolutely justified in their fear of the IRS, which operates on principles that do not obtain elsewhere in the criminal justice system, and that very often place judge, jury, and executioner. And I think that the objections to the IRS's behavior would be obvious to most of the people who are saying, what do you have to worry about, in almost any other circumstance. It seems to me fairly clear that all of the people on this podcast, whether they know it or not, have violated some federal laws this year, maybe this month, maybe today. If the FBI came knocking on my door and said, could I look around your house? Could I follow you around for a day? Can I look through your finances? I think they would find that I have violated some laws. Certainly the local police department would. Not terrible laws. I'm not killing people, not a domestic abuser. But they would find that I had violated some laws. If the federal government, or the local government, if you like, said, we think that we under-enforce our laws, so we're going to start flagging people. We're going to increase the number of people who are flagged. We have an algorithm. It just looks for behavior that's slightly out of the ordinary. Maybe you drove somewhere you don't normally drive. Maybe you had too much cash coming in to your account this month. And then we're going to investigate. We're going to look into them. We're going to find out. Do you think that the response to that would be, well, if you don't have anything to hide, why do you care? If you haven't done anything wrong, why do you care? Of course not. We would say this is un-American. This is a fishing expedition. This is putting the cart before the horse. And that's how I feel about expanding the IRS. It's not that the IRS should not have audit powers at all. If you're going to have a tax system, you have to have a system of enforcement. But to announce ahead of time that there'll be 1.5 million, I think that's the number, more people who are audited, I think is problematic. And it's worth finishing by saying that if you look at how the IRS actually behaves, not how the politicians who fund the IRS talk, but if you look at how the IRS actually behaves, they, like anyone else, go after the low-hanging fruit. They want the easy fights. And when they roll up outside somebody who has $25 billion or even $25 million in net worth's house, and they knock on the door, within a few minutes, a very expensive accountant and a very expensive lawyer come and say, I will take this from here. And it's pretty difficult when you get to that point to increase the haul. It's not particularly difficult to do so with somebody who makes $100,000 a year or $50,000 a year. And if you look at analyses of the IRS's behavior, that's who they end up going after because it's easy. And even if those people get a clean bill of health at the end of it, it still costs them money in CPA fees and in time and in record keeping and in all sorts of other unproductive pursuits that don't help grow the economy and just make us yet again spend our time worrying about the state.
Yeah, MBD, this is amazing. I'm looking at this figure right now. More than half of the agency's audits in 2021 were directed at taxpayers with incomes less than $75,000. More than 4 in 10 of its audits targeted recipients of the Earned Income tax credit. And a big element of this phenomenon is, as Charlie says, you're hitting the taxpayers who can't fight back. So this is much more cost productive if you're the IRS.
Right. And it's if you're a decent tax accountant, you probably make more money in the private sector defending people and defending their incomes from the tax man than you would as an auditor at the IRS. So you generally have a B squad, which is why they want to fight people who are defenseless, people who don't know their rights, don't know how to get a lawyer, don't have the resources to get one, or a good accountant. And they go after them because others will bury them in paperwork, know every bit of the law, every bit of their rights, and good for them that they do. But that's also why, I mean, one of the reasons we have an IRS and have to have it be so extensive, why the IRS and its apologists basically want electronic access to all bank records in the United States, is because our tax system is so incoherent, so full of minutia, horse trading, favors, subsidies, rebates, etc., that it's actually relatively easy to make mistakes on your taxes. Usually, however, I would assert this almost with certainty, usually you are paying too much. Like, just as personal advice, as soon as you can afford one, get an accountant, because they usually know these things and can help you find where you are overpaying your taxes, where the IRS will not know that you're overpaying your taxes year to year.
Michael, can I just add something to that? It's not just mistakes; it's interpretations.
Of course, yeah, no,
and that's the other problem.
No, and
you give the same set of details to 10 different accountants, they will often come up with 10 different tax returns. And the problem with that is that it means that even if you did your taxes perfectly, or your accountant did your taxes perfectly, the IRS can come in and say, well, we slightly disagree with this interpretation, and then throw the whole thing up in the air, even though you've done nothing wrong.
Right. And then it's expensive.
It's like the legal case we were in when we were sued by this climate scientist. The process is the punishment.
Correct. So, but that's all to say is I agree with Charlie. The IRS is a bit of a menace, and the way we do taxes in this country is a kind of punishment already. And yeah, this is only going to make it worse. And by the way, the IRS in the past couple of years, just like the FBI, we were seeing major IRS leaks of tax data that are politically motivated. There's already a problem here, right? Like a bigger problem than we realize, and it's going to get worse.
So, Zan, the Democrats are telling themselves that this Schumer Manchin deal, which has passed the Senate and will pass the House and get inevitably signed, of course, by Joe Biden, that its provisions are all very popular, but this is one where Republicans obviously sense the vulnerability and are going to pound this home and do everything they can to make it the IRS Act.
I think it'll be successful. I mean, first of all, we should remember that this bill actually does raise taxes on low wage earners, and Democrats are trying to claim that it doesn't, or just talking a lot about the parts that focus on corporations, which they think will be more popular to most people. Probably true, but it does raise taxes, and nobody likes to have taxes raised on themselves. So the idea that you're going to pass a bill raising taxes and then somehow drum it up as, popular because it addresses climate change or whatever, I think is ludicrous. It was always a last ditch effort to just get some of the things they wanted when they knew they were about to get pummeled in November anyway. And I think they've made things worse, especially with their response to the legitimate Republican criticism of the IRS, which Charlie and Michael have already laid out in detail. Nobody likes the IRS. Nobody thinks the IRS does its job well. Nobody thinks that our tax system works well. Nobody likes when April rolls around, or March, or whenever it is you sit down to do it, and actually having to file your taxes. Nobody likes doing that, even if, they think that a particular tax system I wouldn't agree with is more just or more fair or acceptable or whatever. Nobody enjoys that process. Nobody who does it for themselves or can't afford an accountant or enjoys that process. And so the idea that you're going to get away with that and get away with claiming that it's just sort of the cheating people who are going to be targeted, we all know that's not true, right? People who are audited often didn't do anything wrong. And then there's no way to prove that you didn't do anything wrong without going through the entire horrible process of setting things right. So empowering the IRS further is not going to make people happy. I think if Republicans stay on this and I think are good at exposing that this is actually what the bill does, that will have a lot of traction in the midterms.
By the way, is there like a kind of realignment logic to this where Democrats are basically saying like, you know what, small businessmen and self-employed people, they're just Republicans anyway. So that's why we have to hire all these new auditors. Like, the billionaires, the ones that aren't already on the side of the Democrats are already getting audited. And you're not squeezing that many pennies out of them because they know where to hide it and know how to defend it legally and with their accountants. But if you own a car dealership, like, basically like every third liberal publication every month does an article about how basically all Republicans are millionaire car dealership owners in the hinterlands of America somewhere. And that's who they're going to target. Right, that is who they're going to target. They're going to target the bodega owners, right? They're going to target small businessmen who are overwhelmed by their own paperwork already, because they don't view them as their constituency anymore, right? Like we should say that there is some kind of naked partisanship to this as well. This isn't just about law and order.
So, next question to you first, Charlie Cook. If you have to choose, would you say the worst part of the Schumer Manchin deal is the climate spending, the corporate taxes, the IRS agents, or something else?
Well, I think it's probably the IRS agents. Followed by the corporate taxes, because for those to be in a bill called the Inflation Reduction Act is just absolutely baffling. I don't like anything in this bill, but a lot of it's just setting money on fire, which is the best thing that Washington can do if it's going to
bring back memories when we first started debating Build Back Better of your setting money on fire argument.
Yeah, there's nothing in here that's permanent, except possibly the IRS agents. There's no new entitlement. The entitlement spending.
I should mention that prescription drug stuff is a nose under the tent for that policy.
That's right. It's a nose under the tent, but most of it, by nature of having been done via reconciliation, is going to have to be renewed. And unless we see a dramatic shift in our politics in the next few months, the Republicans are going to run the House by the time that these provisions need renewing, and they're not going to have to do anything at all to ensure that there is no renewal. They don't have to affirmatively repeal those provisions. Whereas the IRS agents, the earliest that could be reversed is 2025. And they will have developed their own constituency at that point. So I think that's the worst part.
MBD.
I'm tempted to say it's the climate stuff, just because I'm so against the government taxing us to pay for more people and more propagandists for a future of austerity. Like, there's this kind of momentum, this prophet of doom, a kind of cult that argues that essentially humanity is a blight, human life is evil, and fundamentally anti-natural, which is an odd way to approach humans who are themselves part of the environment. And I'm for everything we can do to shut down this cult.
Because I just have another book idea for you. I've been throwing books. You should write a pro-life book in this broadest sense.
Yeah, I hate that these people are arguing for a future of less prosperity, less widely shared goods, wealth, and human life. Like it's kind of
they would argue though that this is just the shining future. This is not austerity or blight. This is windmills and batteries and all the rest of it.
Yeah, their idea is like, oh, you'll be riding a cycle next to like a pleasant creek, and there won't be any traffic. Okay, but what they're really like arguing for is like billions of people in poverty that are, if unless they can, or they're arguing for kind of like soft extermination of people. I mean, by preventing them from ever being born at all. So, like, I'm against. I find that the most dangerous thing.
Zan, soft extermination. Segue over to you.
Yeah, I would definitely read Michael on that. And I kind of agree. I would give an answer in a similar vein, not about climate change, but to me, I think that the corporate tax. The question is less which of these is the most permanent or the most damaging to current inflation problem. I think that the worst is the corporate taxes because it indicates the attitude of the people passing this bill, which is that corporations are just kind of this faceless entity out there somewhere, and we can just take whatever we need from them to finance everything else, when in fact corporations are owned and run by people, staffed by people, and anything you do raising taxes on them hurts everybody. And it's all part of this idea that, well, of course the government's going to set everything right by just having more money, and we'll just have it by taking it from corporations, which are these, like I said, faceless entities, and it won't hurt anybody. I think that's dangerous.
Corporations are people too, my friend.
It's a dangerous view of government. I think that explains everything about the bill.
I think everyone has made a good case for these particular provisions. I think I'm going to go with IRS agents. With that, let's hear from our second sponsor this episode. Inflation, spiking gas prices, and supply chain disruptions, woke celebs and corporations, political cronies, and big tech, polarization, and a culture in crisis. We know it's hard to stay up to speed with everything that's happening in the world. That's where Acton Unwind comes in. Join excerpts from the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty every Monday as they dissect the latest headlines in an easy-to-unravel roundtable conversation. Chat about politics, religion, and culture through Acton Institute's unique perspective, connecting good intentions with sound economics to promote a free and virtuous society characterized by individual liberty and sustained by religious principles. To subscribe to Acton Unwind, visit acton.org/NR or just search Acton Unwind on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Again, that's acton.org/NR to subscribe. Please check it out. It's acton.org/NR. So, Zan, we've seen a bit of a revival, not at kind of early 2021 level, but a bit of a revival. Well, maybe Joe Biden isn't quite FDR or LBJ, but the White House is making the case that its list of accomplishments matches the first 2 years of any president. And you know what? Maybe Biden knew what he was doing more than he was given credit for all along. Maybe he knew how to handle Joe Manchin. And sure, it's not the massive Build Back Better that Democrats wanted, but it's still another nearly $1 trillion spending on top of the 1.9 and the so-called COVID relief bill at the outset of the administration. And then you have all these bipartisan bills that have passed recently, the gun bill, the CHIPS bill, this burn pit bill. So you know what? This guy has some spring in his step and is reviving his presidency.
No, this is ludicrous for two reasons. The first is that everything that Democrats have actually done, and I'll throw in that Republicans have done when they've cooperated on this bipartisan stuff, all of that is going to prove to have been bad for Americans in the long run. I don't think any of that is actually a success. The simple fact of getting things done or doing something that they want to do isn't actually a success. It might be a proof that they can get their agenda through, but it's not actually a good thing for the country. But secondly, none of that actually has anything to do with Joe Biden. Joe Biden didn't convince Manchin to vote for Build Back Better or, Build Back Better light. Everything that actually had to do with Biden, stepping up and getting something done when he had control over it or he had the ability to influence what was going on has failed miserably. And his poll numbers are showing that. I'll give one example. I wrote the Jolt this morning filling in for Jim. And one of the items I focused on was this series of polls showing that Republican candidates are gaining in congressional districts that Biden won by double digits in 2020. Now, are they going to win those seats? Maybe not. It is internal polling, so who really knows? But that is not a sign of a president who has been successful. And the American people are not just judging him harshly because of inflation. He actually has been a terrible president. He's not all there, right? None of this has had any sign that his fingerprints were even on it, right? When that terrorist was killed last week or the week before, whenever that was, the idea that Biden himself played a major role in decision-making on that, I think, is crazy. We've seen the way that he's operating. He does not look like a president who's fully there. He barely has meetings every day. He spends most of his time in Delaware. He is not actually in charge. And so the fact that other people, pretending that he's in charge have rammed things Democrats want through is not a sign of a successful presidency.
Yeah, so Charlie Zan is right, of course, that Biden he hasn't persuaded the public of anything except for his incompetence. He hasn't moved the needle on anything. He had zero to do with the Schumer-Manchin deal coming together. He was, quarantined after this bounce back version of COVID and, wasn't working the phones as far as you can tell from the reporting very hard. There were some White House staffers involved in liaison, to Schumer or to Manchin. But devil's advocate, you can say, well, he has a 50-50 Senate. There wasn't a lot that he realistically could do. And Yuval Levin kind of made this point in a corner post yesterday. But given the constraints, and once you jettisoned the ridiculous FDR and LBJ comparisons, and once you subtract the ridiculous advocacy around the voting rights bill that was never going to pass, they've probably achieved kind of the maximum they plausibly could achieve legislatively given the constraints. So why isn't that pretty good from their perspective?
Well, what have they achieved? Maybe in relative terms, you can make that case. But in absolute terms, what have they achieved? They spent $2 trillion last year, or at least allocated it, and it swiftly caused the worst inflation in 40 years. Now they have a bill that pretends to deal with that inflation, but doesn't do anything about it. They've made no permanent changes. What have they achieved? I'm not saying I like what they've done. I'm not saying I support the American Rescue Plan or the Inflation Reduction Act. I'm not saying that they haven't had an effect. But the reason people remember Franklin Roosevelt and Lyndon Johnson and Ronald Reagan is that they made profound and permanent changes to the trajectory of the country and the relationship that the federal government has with the citizenry. Even Barack Obama, who didn't get much done after 2010, can point to one law in particular, Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act, and say, look, it's still on the books. This is now how we do private healthcare. Name me a law that Joe Biden has signed that does that. I can't find one. It's made no alterations that will last beyond 2024 or 2025 to the social contract. All of the proposed structural changes from Build Back Better were taken out. All of them. At one point, we were debating which one big structural change will eventually make it into that bill. What will this Bernie Sanders size pot simmer off? And what will be left? Will it be childcare? Nope. What's that? Nothing. I think it's sound and fury signifying nothing. I think it's remarkably damaging because we don't have any money left because we're still running massive deficits.
Charlie, what they would argue, I think, on the transformational front, it is climate. They're doing all these things to help ease out fossil fuel and to tilt the playing field way over on the side of renewables.
And I think that's nonsense. I think the vast majority of that money is going to be burned. And the consequences of the inflationary pressures that were exacerbated by the American Rescue Plan and the natural economic cycles that are the result of our having come out of COVID have pushed Americans into the most pro-energy mindset they have probably had in 2 decades. And I think that the moment that Republicans retake Congress or the White House, I think we're going to see an explosion in drilling and the restoration of old-fashioned non-green energy independence. Meanwhile, we're going to read all sorts of Solyndra-style stories about how the supposed subsidies, of which the Democrats are so proud, did absolutely nothing, and that the advances that they supposedly engendered were already there. America is already in a pretty good position in reducing carbon emissions, and it has not been driven by government spending or subsidies at any point. I mean, it's telling that the window that they have put into this bill to judge themselves by starts in 2005?
Yeah. Yeah, most of it's already taken place.
Most of it's already taken place. I again, I don't think that it is irrelevant because the damage that is caused by the Democrats' profligacy, which is built atop Republican profligacy, let's not forget that Republicans are frauds when it comes to the deficit and the debt as well, has been remarkable. I mean, the debt has grown. We have no plan whatsoever to deal with the deficit. We last year spent $2 trillion we didn't need to. We've just added another $750 billion we didn't need to. And the economy is much worse off as a result of all of that behavior than it would have been otherwise, although a lot of the damage had been done by COVID. I just don't see this president and this Congress having altered the trajectory. And I think it's important because the biggest problems in American politics come from entitlement programs. You can sustain for a little bit inflation or higher taxes or a bad piece of spending, but because of the filibuster, which I support, and because of the nature of entitlement programs, once you get a big change in, Americans quite quickly move to their conservatism bias, and they fold that into the baseline. And that can work the other way too. Republicans have been extremely successful at cutting taxes that don't get restored, at least in any meaningful sense, over time. And I don't see anything that Biden has done that fits that bill.
So, MBD, you think that Biden is on the upswing?
Yeah, I do. I think, there are signs about, deflation coming in some of the, major commodities. And I think that is very positive for Biden. I think I almost disagree with something Charlie said. Maybe, I don't know. But he said you can handle inflation for a little bit. I'm not sure. I think the persistence of inflation from the late 60s through the 70s is a major aggravating factor in why there was such political radicalism and violence, that there seemed to be a kind of a fundamental betrayal of the American dream in those years. The idea that if you work hard and play by the rules, you'll get ahead. Well, not when the treadmill of prices is running away from you. I think inflation's really dangerous, and if it's coming to an end soon, partly because all central banks across the world are acting against it at once and in concert, that really helps Biden. I think after all the sound and fury after the Georgia elections about how Biden would be LBJ, I actually think what we've gotten in the CHIPS Act, the burn pits, the Inflation Reduction Act, I actually think what you've gotten is something closer to what Biden actually campaigned on in 2020, which is normality, right? That I'm going to put things back to normal. These are kind of almost normal sized Democratic bills with Democratic priorities and Democratic politics attached to them. And I just think the grab bag approach, even if it none of us think these are going to be transformative. We know that in a couple of years, the environmentalists will put the doomsday clock back on the world. We know that. But like going into an election, just being able to say, did something on prescription drugs, did something for veterans, did something for manufacturing with chips, did something for the environment, to get young people excited. I think that's almost what the premise of Biden's presidency was supposed to be before they thought they were going to get a Senate majority and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was shooting the moon.
I can see that. I can see that argument, but I just think everything around these relatively normal bills is so abnormal. Inflation, which you've already discussed, and make a case, a reasonable one that's going to be diminishing over time. But the border, Afghanistan, just the broader sense that our politics and political culture has become deranged, and just the sense that Biden is just simply not up for this job and is in some form of decline that's evident to everyone's eyes. I wrote about this in a column today. There was a YouGov Yahoo News poll that was running cold for Biden, had him 35% approval, which is pretty low. I don't know, maybe Quinnipiac gets him down that low. He's usually a little higher than that, upper 30s or lower 40s, but only 18% of people want him to run again. Only 29% of his own voters want him to run again. And that's just an astonishing repudiation that goes to the fact that this is not, no matter how normal he wants to be, and actually he's gone along with, every initiative of the left, at least rhetorically, pretty much. He hasn't wanted to be, the Joe Biden from the campaign, but even if he were, it's just, he's not normal. It's just, and it doesn't feel normal, and everyone realizes.
No, it's true. And on executive actions, like on the trans issues and stuff like that, he's been really egregious and not like a careful centrist Democrat, which he was supposed to be. So,
just to echo something that Rich said, I'm not sure that you get credit when you shoot for the moon but only make it to the clouds. Now, this is something that irritated me in the Obama years. For 8 years, actually maybe 6, Obama tried to pass draconian gun control, and he failed. And when he left office, Democrats said, "Why were you so worried about it? See, we didn't even do anything." Okay, because you failed, because you were stopped, because the other party got in the way, because people went out and voted, because they halted your agenda. I mean, Obama wanted to ban the most commonly owned rifle in the country. He wanted to ban normal magazines. He wanted to impose background checks on private transfers. He didn't get to do those things. And then the left sort of cynically said, "See, there's your radical." I don't understand how it can be normal for Biden to say, "I want to spend $6 trillion. All right, 5. All right, 4. All right, 3. And just because it gets whittled down to $750 billion in the end, for us to say, "Hey, he seems pretty much within the Democratic mainstream." No, he doesn't. Doesn't seem anywhere close to it.
No, it's true. No, it's true. And listen, I hammered Bush for this because basically he promised that the whole world would become democratic or else, and like in the end it was just like, well, we haven't been attacked again. Like, well, people weren't so happy and they threw him out of office. They threw Republicans out of office. So yeah, it's not a great strategy, but I just think like, this isn't the disaster I feared it was going to be after the Senate elections in Georgia, and they've hit a number of their key interest groups in their pleasure centers before an election. And I don't know, Republicans just seem off their game in the last couple of weeks. And now
the generic congressional ballot has tightened up. So let's go to Zan for the exit question. We're going to go to Biden's polling average, as we have on and off last 2 years or so. He's just a tick below 40, both in the Real Clear Politics and the 538 average. So Zan, in your estimation, come election day in November, Biden will be where he is now in terms of his polling average, or will be lower or higher?
He'll be lower. I think that's definitely a safe bet. It was before, and I think I was the lowest of everyone before, and I was still too high on where he was going. So I'll say he'll keep going down.
Zan's doubling down on lower. Charlie.
Higher.
MBD.
Depends on what Trump does. Biden will rise as the threat of Trump coming back seems more present.
I also think Biden will be higher with that. Quick NR Plus plug, digital subscription service at nationalreview.com. There are all sorts of benefits to it. But what I want to emphasize to our listeners is that it is a really important way to support our valuable journalism. We need people to pay for our product. We think it's very valuable. We assume if you're listening to this podcast, not everyone who listens to this podcast is a devoted reader, but most of you are. We assume if you're reading our stuff all the time, you agree. And we really urge you to please, if you possibly can, to pony up and pay for what you're reading at National Review. It doesn't cost much. We have great first-time deals running at any given moment. Once you signed up, the metered paywall, which you might be trying to defeat and dancing around at the moment, goes away. You don't have to worry about it anymore. The ads, which I'm sure are annoying you, will go away if you sign up and log in. You can comment on articles and blog posts and dig deeper in our community in all sorts of ways. But please, if you value National Review, become a member of NR Plus. With that, let's hit a few other things before we go. MBD, you've been watching Better Call Saul.
Yeah, so I've mentioned it on the corner before and maybe in the podcast before, but I'm really enjoying the final season of Better Call Saul, which the penultimate episode aired last night, the night before we recorded this, and the final episode is next Monday, and I think it feels to me like they are sticking the landing on this and wrapping it up in a very satisfying conclusion, and taken together, these were the two best series on the usually overrated era of television. But Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul delivered in the end.
So Zan, you attended a local Republican club meeting.
I did, and I'm not usually one for political gatherings of this kind. I don't know. I align more with Republicans.
Too crazy, too wild and crazy for you?
Yeah, it's usually
be at home preparing for Advent.
Yeah, this is not something I would ordinarily do, but I happened to run into a really nice lady in my neighborhood who I had seen at a heritage event of mine last month, and she invited my husband and me and our friends who were with us to this local dinner for the Republican Club, and it was a lot of fun. It wasn't exactly our age demographic, but it was great to see what the local community was up to, and most important, a fellow came up and introduced himself as a listener of the editors, a longtime listener,
awesome,
and a big fan in particular of Rich. So it was a memorable evening.
Wow, a really discerning listener. So Charlie Cook, you partook of the Guardians of the Galaxy Cosmic Rewind roller coaster.
I did. I went to Epcot last week with my family. They came over from England, stayed with us here in Florida, and then came to Disney World with us. And as Alexandra will know, because I know she's been on it, you can't actually queue for Guardians of the Galaxy Cosmic Rewind. You have to get in a virtual queue right at the beginning of the day at 7 a.m. and your phone tells you when to go back. And there is a little line once you go back, but your phone does all the work. And we got, I think, 7 or 8 virtual queue tickets and watched in horror as the time for our return moved earlier and earlier and earlier, almost perfectly into line with our lunch reservations at the Teppan Edo Hibachi restaurant. So we said, well, I guess we're not going to get on that ride, but we can't miss lunch. So we went for lunch and ended up drinking quite a lot of white wine and then quite a lot of sake as well, such that by the time lunch was over, we were all a little bit sozzled and confident enough to go up to the ride and plead with the ride operator and say, look, we had these virtual tickets, but we also had a lunch reservation, not really our fault. Thankfully, he said, oh, that's fine. We have a system for that. Just give me your phone. He waved us all in and we got to go on the ride, which I have to say was magnificent, but even more so on a couple of bottles of wine and far too much sake for anyone's good.
I love that word sozzled. I think we need to make it a habit of just working that word in once an episode, no matter what, in some context.
I'll get on that.
So I just read a little summer reading when we were away, this new biography of Rickey Henderson, the great base stealing, mostly Oakland Athletic outfielder, although he pretty much played for every team by the end, including a really notable period with the Yankees. And the subtitle says something about an American original. And boy, I mean, totally an American original, incredible athlete, one of the greatest ball players of all time. The author of this book, a little too woke for me. I could do without the sermonettes about racism that are laced throughout the book, but otherwise, just if you love baseball, especially 1980s baseball, although he played much longer than that, it's just a really fascinating and entertaining read. I won't go on, but I will mention for the devoted baseball fans out there, and you'll know what I'm talking about. I won't go into it, but the John Olerud, the legendary John Olerud story is not true. It is not true. It was made up as a joke and then became an urban legend. But many other stories that you've heard about Rickey Henderson are indeed true. With that, it's time for our editor's pick. MBD. What's your pick?
My pick is Welcome Back from Vacation, Charlie piece. If the raid on Mar-a-Lago was not justified, then what? Which I think just gets to the heart of the matter. So go to National Review Online and read it.
Dan, what's your pick?
My pick is a piece from late last week by Kevin Williamson. It's called For Pro-Lifers, The Fight is Only Just Beginning. And this is something pro-lifers have been saying for a while now, certainly in the lead up to Dobbs, but of course, after the fact too. And Kevin weighs in with particular focus given to the vote in Kansas last week on the failed pro-life constitutional amendment.
Charlie, what's your pick?
My pick is Rick Brookhiser's short tribute to David McCullough, which is one of the most Rick Brookhiser-esque Rick Brookhiser posts I have read recently, because it doesn't just contain Rick Brookhiser's wonderful and inimitable writing style, but it pertains to history, which is, of course, Rick Brookhiser's métier, and David McCullough as well. And it has a lovely little story in it about one of the times they met, which I won't spoil. I would recommend you read yourself.
So my pick is the piece I mentioned earlier by Andy McCarthy that is leading the website as we speak, what the FBI's raid on Mar-a-Lago is really about. And the advantage I have, I can call Andy when I really want to know something about a legal matter or one of these investigative wars. I can call Andy and see what he thinks. The great advantage to being a National Review reader is you get the benefit of all the same wisdom and insight. And this is just another instance, and there have been many, many of them the last several years, where just Andy's work is completely indispensable. So that's it for us. You've been listening to a National Review podcast. Any rebroadcast, retransmission, or account of this game without the express written permission of National Review Magazine is strictly prohibited. This podcast has been produced by the incomparable Sarah Schutte, who makes us sound better than we deserve. Thank you, Charlie. Thank you, Zan. Thank you, MBD. Thanks to Brad Thor's Rising Tiger and Acton Unwind. And thanks especially to all of you for listening. We're the editors. We'll see you next time.